Your law degree, please. That's hardly worth mentioning. The words dripped with mockery as Mark Levin leaned into his microphone, his smirk curling wider with each syllable. A hush rippled across the room. For a split second, no one knew how to react. The cameras caught it all: his condescension, the sneer that carried decades of dismissiveness packed into a single jab. Gasps echoed from the audience. Some shook their heads, others whispered to one another, but everyone understood what had just happened. This wasn't simply a comment about Jasmine Crockett's credentials. It was a deliberate dismissal, a challenge meant to strip away dignity in real time. Levin wasn't just mocking a degree. He was mocking a woman who had clawed her way into public service, mocking every ounce of work she had poured into her life's calling. The insult landed like a slap, echoing louder than his own voice. Viewers watching from home felt it in their chests because this wasn't new. They had seen this posture before, the sneering of men in power who assumed that mocking a woman's hard-earned achievements could erase them. Levin knew exactly what he was doing, or at least he thought he did. He believed his insult would sting, silence, and satisfy the room. But instead, the moment grew heavier. The silence wasn't approval. It was disbelief. The audience wasn't leaning into Levin's words, they were leaning away. And there, in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat, her face calm, her eyes steady. The cameras zoomed in, framing the clash not as words exchanged but as an unmistakable battle line. On one side, arrogance, cloaked in bravado. On the other, dignity, unshaken, waiting for its turn to speak. The insult had landed, yes. But what Levin hadn't counted on was the ripple effect, how millions would watch and hear not only what he said but what it revealed. His mockery spoke louder about him than it ever could about her. And in that electric pause, as the world seemed to hold its breath, one question lingered above all else: how would Jasmine Crockett respond? Because what came next would not just be a defense. It would be a turning point. But no one was ready for how Jasmine Crockett would answer. The stage was no ordinary platform. It wasn't just two people exchanging barbs, it was a nationally televised debate, broadcast in prime time, where every pause, every insult, every flash of composure was being dissected in real time by millions across the country. The air inside the hall buzzed with anticipation long before Mark Levin leaned into that microphone. The nation's divisions were already on full display, and this debate promised to expose them even further. America was at a crossroads. Economic anxiety, culture wars, and a relentless cycle of media outrage had created a volatile atmosphere. People weren't just tuning in for policy, they were tuning in for a fight, for proof that someone on their side could land the punch that silenced the other. In that environment, credentials weren't just qualifications, they were weapons. And when Levin mocked Jasmine Crockett's law degree, he wasn't simply belittling her resume. He was striking at something deeper, something far more visceral. Because in America, a degree doesn't just hang on a wall. For countless immigrants, for women who broke barriers, for Black Americans whose grandparents were denied opportunities, a degree represents struggle, sacrifice, and survival. It is proof that hard work can pry open doors that were meant to stay locked. Levin's words weren't just condescension, they were an attempt to delegitimize an entire journey. And everyone watching knew it. The sting of his words reached beyond Crockett herself, echoing in living rooms where families sat remembering their own sacrifices, parents who had worked double shifts to put a child through school. Students who had clawed through systemic barriers just to graduate. Workers who had balanced 3 jobs while studying at night. All of them heard Levin's mockery as if it were aimed at them. But this moment wasn't just about Levin's arrogance. It was about the symbolism of who sat across from him. Jasmine Crockett represented something bigger, the idea that credentials hard-earned through persistence are sacred, that legitimacy cannot be mocked out of existence. Her calm stare in the face of his ridicule was more than silence, it was the gathering of a storm. The political climate made that storm even sharper. With conversations about equity, representation, and justice raging across the country, this confrontation became more than a clash of personalities. It was a clash of worldviews, one that thrived on diminishing others versus one that embodied resilience. Levin's jab was an attempt to shrink the space Jasmine Crockett occupied. But what he didn't realize was that he had just enlarged it, because the moment he mocked her, he mocked everyone who had fought to be taken seriously in a room that wasn't built for them. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. Every second on that stage was ammunition for headlines, for social media clips, for the narratives that shape how history remembers a moment. Crockett wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the millions who saw themselves in her story. The insult had transformed the debate into something larger, a referendum on whose identity counts, whose achievements matter, and whose dignity deserves to be honored. Because what happened next didn't just defend a degree, it defended an entire identity. And in that defense, Crockett was about to show the country that silence could be broken not with rage, but with precision, courage, and an answer that would leave even her loudest critic stunned. Mark Levin has never been a man known for restraint. For decades, his voice has blared across America's airwaves, a storm of certainty wrapped in rapid-fire delivery. To his followers, he is a truth-teller, a warrior against what he brands the corruption of Washington and the so-called liberal elite. To his critics, he is a provocateur, loud, caustic, and perpetually spoiling for a fight. Either way, Levin has built an empire on one thing, the sound of his own conviction. Born from the conservative radio boom, Levin carved his niche by going further than most were willing to go. Where others might argue policy, he scorched the earth. Where others debated, he dismissed. His reputation wasn't built on careful persuasion but on relentless attack. Every broadcast, every monologue, every best-selling book carried the same refrain: the country is under siege, and only the vigilant led by voices like his can save it. That certainty drew an audience hungry for a champion who shouted back at the forces they feared were changing the country beyond recognition. But beneath the bravado lies a pattern. Levin's trademark isn't just critique, it's mockery. He doesn't merely disagree with opponents, he belittles them. He ridicules their intelligence, questions their legitimacy, and sneers at their credentials. This is the Levin brand, to shrink opponents in the eyes of his listeners so that his dominance seems inevitable. He has mastered the art of insult, not as an offhand tactic, but as a central weapon in his arsenal. His fans cheer this approach. To them, Levin embodies defiance. His booming put-downs are cathartic, a release valve for grievances they feel but cannot voice. When Levin mocks, they laugh. When he dismisses, they nod in agreement. The man has built a community not on shared policy goals but on shared contempt for his chosen adversaries. It's a loyalty forged in disdain. And yet, this posture carries contradictions. Levin proclaims himself a patriot, a defender of America's founding ideals. He reveres the Constitution, invokes the wisdom of the founders, and demands respect for the nation's institutions. But when confronting opponents, his reverence falters. Patriotism, in Levin's hands, often bends into personal attack. Respect for the Republic doesn't extend to respect for those who serve it if they happen to disagree with him. His words, meant to elevate American dignity, routinely undermine the very principles he claims to guard. Nowhere is this contradiction sharper than when Levin confronts people whose very existence defies the expectations of his audience: women, immigrants, people of color who occupy seats of power. In those moments, his mockery intensifies, his tone sharpens. The man who professes love for American opportunity sneers at those who embody it most authentically. The man who praises hard work dismisses it when the worker does not look like him. That is the Levin paradox. He demands respect but rarely gives it. He lauds accomplishment in the abstract but belittles it in the flesh. And it is precisely this contradiction that set the stage for his downfall on that night with Jasmine Crockett. Because Crockett was not just another opponent. She was a living, breathing contradiction to the narrative Levin thrives on. A black woman who had earned her law degree through grit, who had risen to represent her community, who had proven through both education and public service that she deserved her seat at the table. In her very presence, she embodied the American promise that Levin claimed to defend. But rather than honor it, he mocked it. And that mockery was not a slip of the tongue. It was instinct. It was muscle memory, the automatic reflex of a man who has spent a career equating insult with victory. Levin had been rewarded too many times for his barbs, too many times for his sneers. His fans loved it, the press covered it, and his reputation as a bulldog only grew. Why would this time be any different? What Levin did not anticipate was the audience beyond his base. For years, his words had lived in echo chambers, cheered by those predisposed to AGR. For years, his words had lived in echo chambers, cheered by those predisposed to agree. But the cameras that night weren't broadcasting to a loyal fanbase alone, they were capturing every insult for a divided nation hungry for symbols, for moments that cut through noise and revealed something deeper. Millions of eyes, many of them skeptical, were watching. And when Levin chose mockery over respect, when he chose sneer over substance, he didn't just reveal his disdain for Jasmine Crockett. He revealed the hollowness of his own posture. The patriot who spoke of dignity showed none. The champion of American merit dismissed it when it didn't align with his worldview. He believed the room would laugh with him, that the jab would land as another victorious punchline. But what Levin had not learned, what he was about to discover in the most public way possible, is that mockery loses its edge when it strikes against a wall of dignity. And that wall was about to answer him. But Levin had no idea his mockery was about to backfire in front of millions. Long before Jasmine Crockett sat across from Mark Levin, staring down the sneer that questioned her legitimacy, she was a young woman fighting to carve her place in a world that seemed determined to keep its doors shut. Her story did not begin with titles or microphones. It began with long nights, empty bank accounts, and the quiet certainty that if she kept moving forward, no wall could hold her back. Jasmine grew up in a family that taught her two unshakable lessons: work hard, and never forget who you are. Those lessons became her compass as she pursued education. Law school wasn't handed to her, it was wrestled from the hands of adversity. Tuition bills piled up higher than the stacks of case law she studied. She juggled jobs, sometimes taking shifts that bled into dawn, then forcing herself awake after a few hours of rest to pore over legal briefs. Where others had a cushion, she had grit. Where others had privilege, she had persistence. Her classmates remember her not as the loudest in the room, but as the one who refused to quit. When exams loomed and stress broke others down, Jasmine pressed forward. She wasn't studying for prestige. She was studying for survival, for the ability to defend people who couldn't afford representation, for the chance to stand in courtrooms where voices like hers were rarely heard. Earning her law degree wasn't the end of that struggle, it was the beginning of her service. She took cases others overlooked, standing beside clients who had been chewed up and spat out by a system stacked against them. She fought for the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten people who saw in her not just an attorney, but proof that they too mattered. This wasn't glamorous work. It meant hours in cramped offices, endless paperwork, and emotional battles that didn't always end in victory. But for Jasmine, each case was part of a larger war, the fight to make justice something more than a slogan. Her persistence caught the attention of her community, who saw in her a leader unwilling to be intimidated. That recognition pulled her into public service, where the stakes grew higher but the mission remained the same: stand up for those who couldn't stand alone. As she stepped into politics, the obstacles multiplied. Critics dismissed her as too young, too inexperienced, too outspoken. Others whispered the coded language that so many women of color hear: unqualified, angry, radical. Every slight was meant to chip away at her resolve, to remind her that the halls of power were not built with her in mind. But instead of retreating, she carried those labels like fuel. Every dismissal became another reason to speak louder, to push harder, to claim the space that generations before her had been denied. Her career milestones tell the story of that climb. Elected to represent her district, she made headlines not for showmanship, but for speaking directly to the needs of her constituents. She became a champion for working families, a defender of voting rights, an advocate for reform in a system too often rigged against the vulnerable. Her speeches weren't polished rehearsals, they were raw, real, and filled with the fire of someone who knew firsthand what was at stake. Through it all, Jasmine never let the spotlight redefine her purpose. She wasn't there to bask in attention. She was there to serve. That's why the attack on her law degree cut deeper than Levin realized. To mock those years of sacrifice, those nights of exhaustion, those clients who had placed their trust in her, it wasn't just an insult to her. It was an insult to everyone she had carried with her along the way. And yet, Jasmine Crockett did not meet those obstacles with bitterness. She met them with calm. She had learned early that composure could disarm arrogance faster than rage ever could. Each courtroom, each campaign, each challenge had trained her to face derision with dignity. That training had prepared her for Levin's sneer in ways he could never understand. Because Crockett knew something Levin didn't, every struggle had been rehearsal. Every sleepless night in law school, every courtroom battle, every dismissal by critics had been shaping her into the kind of leader who doesn't need to shout to command attention. She had built herself, brick by brick, into someone who could withstand mockery without flinching, someone who could turn insult into inspiration. And so, as she sat there under the bright lights of that televised debate, facing the full weight of Levin's condescension, Jasmine didn't merely hear a personal attack. She heard the echoes of every barrier she had already broken. She remembered the sacrifices that had carried her here. She understood that this wasn't just another insult, it was another test. And tests, after all, were nothing new. It was those very battles, those years of sacrifice, persistence, and service, that prepared her for this exact moment. The insult should have been enough. Most people, after hearing their hard-won credentials mocked in front of millions, would have snapped back immediately, their voice rising in anger. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply sat, her gaze fixed, her posture unshaken, as if Levin's words had bounced off her like dull stones thrown against steel. Levin, sensing no immediate retaliation, mistook her composure for weakness. He pressed on, his voice louder, his gestures sharper, the rhythm of his mockery quickening like a man who believed he had found an opening. Law degrees are handed out like candy these days, he jeered, leaning back in his chair, smirking as though the entire room should share in his laughter. Anyone can wave one around and pretend to be an expert. It doesn't mean a thing. A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the knowing laughter Levin had anticipated. It was discomfort. Shifting in seats. Glances exchanged. A subtle but unmistakable unease. People weren't laughing with him, they were bracing for what they sensed was coming. Crockett remained still. Every second she held her silence, the contrast grew starker. Levin's arrogance spilled unchecked, his tone dripping with disdain. He filled the room with noise. She filled it with composure. And in that contrast, the real power began to shift. For viewers at home, the tension was almost unbearable. They leaned closer to their screens, hearts quickening, waiting for Crockett's response. They had seen her story, her grit, her sacrifice. They knew what she represented. They knew she wasn't about to let this pass. But when? How? Levin doubled down again, mocking not just her degree but the institutions that had trained her. Some schools, he scoffed, will graduate anybody just to cash a check. Isn't that right? His words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and choking. The audience stirred louder now, some with outrage, others with anticipation. Every jab Levin launched no longer landed as dominance but as desperation. It was the performance of a man trying to convince himself that he still held control. And still, Crockett said nothing. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Each passing moment became a rope Levin wound around himself, tighter and tighter, until the crowd was watching not her humiliation, but his unraveling. And then something remarkable happened. As Levin continued, his rhythm faltered. His words, once sharp and self-assured, began to stumble. The smirk slipped, just for a second, as he realized the audience wasn't giving him the validation he craved. He had swung again and again, but his opponent had refused to engage. The energy in the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. Crockett exhaled slowly, deliberately, her composure radiating like a shield. And in that calm, she shifted the narrative. Levin's arrogance was no longer the headline, it was the setup. The stage was no longer his, it was hers. Those watching at home could feel it. They had seen men like Levin before, puffed up with self-importance, confusing loudness for strength. And they had seen women like Crockett, patient, deliberate, calculating the exact moment to strike. Every second of silence became a promise that when she did respond, it would not be ordinary. It would be devastating. Levin launched one final barb, waving his hand dismissively as though brushing her from the stage. Frankly, he said, I don't know why we're even pretending this is a serious debate. Some people just aren't in the same league. The words dropped like a hammer, arrogant and final. The audience gasped audibly this time, the tension breaking into outright shock. Some shook their heads, others glared at Levin, but all eyes turned back to Crockett. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward in her chair. Her eyes locked on Levin, unblinking, unshaken, utterly calm. The crowd fell silent, the murmurs cut short. The air thickened. The camera zoomed closer. And then, Crockett leaned forward, and the silence before her words was deafening. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, she did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words slid into the air like the first crack of thunder before a storm, low, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Mark, she said evenly, her eyes steady, the difference between us is that I don't have to scream to sound important. I let my work speak for me. The room shifted. Heads turned. A murmur swept the audience. Levin blinked, as though caught off guard by the restraint in her tone. He had expected fire, expected rage. What he received was calm precision, and it cut sharper than any shout could. Crockett leaned a little closer to her microphone, her voice carrying with the steady weight of conviction. Since you seem to have questions about my law degree, let me clear something up. I earned it. Every hour in class, every late night studying, every debt I carried on my shoulders, I earned it. No one handed it to me. I worked for it, just like I've worked for every client who couldn't afford a voice of their own. The audience erupted in applause, sharp and immediate. Levin's smirk faltered. He forced a laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing her words, but the cameras caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Crockett didn't let the moment go. She pressed forward, her tone sharpening just enough to slice through the noise. You mock my credentials, but let's talk about what that really means. When you sneer at my degree, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking every young woman who stayed up nights to make grades while holding down 2 jobs. You're mocking every black student who was told they didn't belong in the classroom but showed up anyway. You're mocking every immigrant parent who worked double shifts just so their child could have the chance to sit where I sat. That's who you insult when you dismiss my education. Gasps rang out, followed by cheers. The crowd, once tense, was now firmly on her side. The energy flipped, the atmosphere alive with vindication. Levin shifted in his chair, tugged at his collar, forced another smile that looked more like a grimace. His usual confidence was crumbling under the weight of her words. She paused, letting the silence return, letting the audience hang on the edge of her next sentence. Then she delivered the line that pierced like a blade. The truth is, you don't question my degree because it isn't legitimate. You question it because I'm legitimate. And that scares you. The hall erupted. Applause thundered, people rose to their feet, some pounding their hands against the armrests in approval. The cameras swung to catch audience members nodding fiercely, eyes lit with something that felt bigger than politics, it felt like justice. Levin opened his mouth to reply, but Crockett wasn't finished. She raised her hand slightly, commanding the room without force, just presence. You see, Mark, the funny thing about arrogance is that it collapses under the weight of facts. My record is public. The cases I've taken, the communities I've served, the legislation I've fought for, it's all there. Meanwhile, all you've offered tonight is mockery. Not solutions. Not truth. Just noise. Every sentence landed like a hammer on stone, breaking Levin's posture piece by piece. His hands, once animated with grand gestures, now fidgeted on the desk. His trademark sneer looked brittle, a mask threatening to crack. Crockett, sensing the shift, drove the point home. You call yourself a patriot, you claim to love this country. But when a black woman earns her way into these halls, you mock her for it. When the daughter of working people achieves what you claim America is all about hard work, sacrifice, perseverance, you laugh at her. Tell me, Mark, what exactly is patriotic about belittling the very promise of this nation? The audience roared again. Cheers rose like a wave, washing over Levin's forced composure. The cameras cut to faces in the crowd, some beaming, some shaking their heads at Levin in disbelief. And then, Crockett delivered the coup de grace, the line that would be replayed endlessly in clips and hashtags across social media. She looked him dead in the eye, her voice steady, her tone unshakable. You tried to silence me with mockery. But tonight, your silence says more about you than my degree ever could. The room froze. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but stillness, no jeers, no laughter, no dismissive chuckles. Just silence, thick and undeniable, the silence of a man who had run out of weapons against a woman who refused to bow. And then, as if on cue, the hall exploded. Applause thundered through the chamber. People rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, stamping the ground. The sound was deafening, but it was the silence that lingered in memory. The silence that Levin could not break. The silence that revealed, to everyone watching, who had truly won the night. Levin sat back, his eyes darting, his smirk gone. For once, the man who built a career on words had none. His mockery lay in tatters, dismantled not with anger but with clarity, not with volume but with truth. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply leaned back in her chair, calm once more, her point made, her dignity intact. She had turned insult into indictment, mockery into revelation. The cameras caught the moment the hero's poise, the villain's collapse. Viewers at home felt it in their bones. They knew they had witnessed not just a clapback, but a turning point. A moment where arrogance fell silent before dignity, where mockery crumbled before truth. And as the applause carried on, as Levin's eyes searched for footing that wasn't there, the story was no longer his. It was hers. But the impact didn't stop inside those four walls. The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and delivered her devastating counterattack, it was already bigger than the debate stage. The applause inside those four walls was only the spark. The explosion happened online. Within minutes, clips of her clapback flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. A shaky phone recording taken from the audience shot upward into millions of views before the debate was even over. The caption read simply, "She silenced the room." Hashtags began trending almost instantly, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag degrees matter, hashtag silence by truth. Each tag carried the electricity of vindication, as though millions of viewers who had been waiting for someone to stand tall against arrogance finally saw it happen in real time. Memes followed just as quickly. Someone froze the exact moment Levin's smirk cracked and paired it with Crockett's calm stare. Another looped the clip of her final line, "Your silence says more about you than my degree ever could," with dramatic music swelling underneath. For younger audiences, it wasn't just politics, it was a cultural moment, the kind that spreads across group chats and digital feeds like wildfire. Journalists seized on it, too. Headlines ran by morning, Crockett's calm dismantles Levin's mockery, debate's silence reverberates nationwide, the clapback heard around America. Pundits dissected every detail on cable news, marveling at the composure, replaying the pause, analyzing the way Levin's body language shrank in real time. What had started as a sneer about her degree had transformed into a national conversation about legitimacy, respect, and dignity. Celebrities joined in. Actors, musicians, and authors tweeted their support. One posted, "Jasmine Crockett reminded us all tonight that strength isn't about shouting, it's about standing firm in who you are." Another, "As a woman of color with a degree I fought for, I felt seen tonight. Thank you, Representative Crockett." The validation poured in from every corner, turning what Levin meant as humiliation into Crockett's coronation. But it wasn't only the famous voices. Ordinary citizens amplified the moment, sharing their own stories under Crockett's name. A nursing student posted, "I'm juggling 3 jobs to get my degree. Tonight I watched Jasmine Crockett prove that it's worth it." A teacher wrote, "Every time someone mocks my profession, I'll remember her words. Credentials matter because the work behind them matters." Hashtags became confessionals, each retweet weaving her clapback into a larger tapestry of identity and pride. Levin, meanwhile, found himself on the wrong end of the spotlight. Where Crockett's face appeared alongside words like grace and dignity, his appeared in punchlines. Commentators mocked his faltering expression, late-night hosts replayed his sneer dissolving into silence, and even some of his allies admitted privately that he had overplayed his hand. The man who thrived on control of the narrative suddenly found himself the butt of it. And that, perhaps, was the deepest twist of all. Levin had sought to strip dignity away from Crockett by mocking her law degree. Instead, he stripped dignity from himself. The more he tried to recover, the more people replayed the moment of collapse. Silence followed him, not the silence of command, but the silence of defeat. For Crockett, the aftermath was more than applause. It was elevation. Overnight, she became a symbol of what it means to meet arrogance with poise. Commentators compared her calm stare to historic debate moments where truth cut through bluster. Students across the country shared her speech as motivation. The ripple effect was undeniable. Crockett's name, once confined to the circles of her constituency, now carried across the nation. She wasn't just a representative anymore, she was a figure of cultural resilience. Her victory wasn't in humiliating Levin, it was in embodying something larger than herself, something millions of people had been waiting to see reflected. And yet, the most powerful part of this story wasn't the takedown itself. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett made it clear that the moment was never just about her. The law degree Levin had mocked wasn't the centerpiece of her victory, it was the symbol of something far more enduring. When reporters asked her about the exchange, she reframed the entire conversation with characteristic clarity. "This isn't about a piece of paper," she said. "It's about respect. It's about service. It's about identity. Because a degree, a title, or an office doesn't mean anything unless it's used to lift others up." That reframing struck a chord. People began to understand the confrontation not simply as a sparring match between two political figures, but as a mirror reflecting something deeper about the country itself. On one side stood arrogance, loud, dismissive, certain that mockery could erase legitimacy. On the other stood dignity, quiet, steady, grounded in the unshakable truth that worth is earned through sacrifice and service. And in that contrast, the lesson was unmistakable: arrogance crumbles, but dignity endures. Crockett's story illuminated that truth. She hadn't silenced Levin by raising her volume or matching his disdain. She had silenced him by standing in the fullness of her own journey, by embodying every late night, every obstacle overcome, every act of service that had carried her to that moment. The power of her response came not from a single line, but from the undeniable weight of a life lived in pursuit of justice. For many who watched, her clapback became more than a viral clip. It became a reminder of what America is supposed to mean. Parents pointed to her example for their children, telling them that credentials are not to be mocked, they are to be earned. Teachers replayed her speech in classrooms as proof that composure can outlast arrogance. Young people of color, women, immigrants, and first-generation students saw themselves in her words and felt their own legitimacy affirmed. Her voice reminded America that dignity doesn't need permission. It doesn't bow to arrogance. It doesn't shrink in the face of insult. Dignity speaks softly, but when it does, the noise of mockery collapses under its weight. And there was another lesson, too, one that went beyond politics. Crockett's response revealed that respect is not a gift handed down by the powerful, it is a right claimed by those who have done the work, made the sacrifices, and stood their ground. In that sense, her moment was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had been mocked for trying to climb higher, everyone who had carried the weight of proving themselves again and again. By turning Levin's insult into a universal truth, Crockett transcended the debate stage. Her story was no longer about credentials, it was about identity. And her calm defiance told the nation something it desperately needed to hear, that service, sacrifice, and dignity will always outlast the arrogance of those who try to erase them. As one commentator wrote in the aftermath, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She reminded America that credentials aren't mocked, they're earned. And with that reminder, the debate became more than a moment in time. It became a lesson in endurance, a symbol of resilience, a story that will be told long after the cameras stop rolling. Mark Levin mocked Jasmine Crockett's law degree. He thought a sneer could erase years of sacrifice, study, and service. But instead, he handed her the stage, and in one calm, devastating clapback, she silenced the room. What was meant as humiliation became victory. What was meant as dismissal became affirmation. And what was meant to diminish her instead elevated her into a symbol of dignity answering arrogance. That's the power of this moment. It isn't just about one debate, one insult, or one degree. It's about what happens every time arrogance tries to drown out truth, every time mockery tries to strip someone of their legitimacy, every time the loudest voice in the room assumes it will also be the strongest. Because time and again, dignity proves louder. Time and again, composure defeats chaos. Time and again, truth silences noise. So ask yourself, what do we want to reward? The arrogance of those who belittle, or the resilience of those who rise? Crockett's example is clear. When arrogance speaks, let dignity answer. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the pride, the vindication, the inspiration in her words, don't let it stop here. Share this moment. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story where dignity triumphs. And most importantly, join the growing movement for truth, respect, and resilience in public life. Because this isn't just about one debate, it's about the kind of voices we choose to amplify as a nation. Levin's mockery may have sparked the moment. But it was Jasmine Crockett's voice that carried it forward. And with your voice added to hers, the echo of dignity will always outlast the noise of arrogance.